Gwych iawn. Noswaith a chroeso cynnes iawn I chi. A very warm welcome to everybody to the Drum, to the National Library of Wales. Yma, I chi'n ddewr iawn am fod wedi mentro allan heno. And to everybody online following us as well. Mae'n noson fochaidd tu allan. Mae gyda ni staff ychwanegol ar y drws I ofalu bod pobl yn gallu gadael heno yn ddiogel, felly peidiwch y poeni. We have some additional members of staff manning the doors, so we'll be ensuring that everybody makes a safe exit tonight after the talk. All of you at home needn't to worry about that. Felly, nawn ni ddechrau. Deiseb Heddwch Menywod Cymru, the Welsh Women's Peace Petition. It's just an incredible story, and I'm sure everybody here knows quite a bit about it already. Last night, we had a terrific evening here in the National Library. We were opening the new permanent exhibition, the new home for the Welsh Women's Peace Petition. Some fantastic interpretation, some wonderful audiovisual material, some wonderful archive for everybody to enjoy, learning about that remarkable feat achieved by the women and the 390,296 women who signed that petition in support of that campaign. It's just an incredible journey, and we still feel as though we're on it. I'm not sure what part of the journey, it's not a roller coaster, but it's definitely an exciting journey to be on, and we feel it's a privilege, a huge privilege as a library to be the home and taking care of that legacy. On to our talk tonight. Our talk tonight is going to focus on Elined Prys, one of the notable actors in that story. I'm going to speak a little bit about our speakers as well, just to give you an idea. And we're also going to have a Q&A session after the talk as well. So at home and here, no pressure, but I do expect you to ask some incisive questions here and online. So get ready for that. And we've got a special treat as well, because we have members of Elined's family, and I just want to extend a very, very warm welcome to you all, Mark, Michelle and Christopher. Welcome, Christopher, to Aberystwyth. First time? Not sure. Yes, which is great. So thank you. We'll hear a little bit more about that later. So our speakers, Susan and Ellen, are members of the Heddwch Nain Mam-gu Grandma's Peace USA group, who have worked relentlessly to tell the story of the peace petition. Now, they'll be sharing the history of the petition, but the focus will be to shed some new light on Elined Prys, one of the delegates of the peace appeal. Now, modern researchers have been able to tell us a lot about two of the delegates, in particular, Hughes Griffiths and Mary Ellis. But Elined proved to be more of a mystery until recently. But thanks to the generosity of Elined's family and financial donations, they have discovered many personal letters written by Elined to her family during the crucial post-war years 1919 to 1924. So, our speakers. Susan Davies Sit was born in Colwyn Bay and moved overseas in her late 20s to work in hospitals and the hospitality industry. She now lives with her family in Connecticut, USA. Did I pronounce that right? I always struggle with Connecticut. I know, that's what I want to say. And in her retirement, she's a member of Heddwch Nain Mam-gu USA, the president of the Welsh Society of Western New England, and team member of Cymdeithas Madog, a Welsh language learning organisation in America. And Ellen Walker Siuta. Have I said that right? Yes, thank you. That's a relief. Was born in Criccieth, which is easier for me to say. and moved to the US in 1980 and has travelled extensively with her family, both overseas and in the USA, and now lives in Leesburg, Virginia. She's a retired teacher and director and a member of Heddwch Nain, Mam-gu UDA and the Washington DC Welsh Society. Rhowch groeso, please welcome Ellen and Susan. Diolch.
Croeso, noswaith da chi. Good evening and welcome. 2024 marked the centenary of one of the most important moments in Welsh history, Welsh women's history, the peace appeal and the petition sent by the women of Wales to the women of America. Ellen and I are members of the group Heddwch Nain, Mam-gu UDA, and for the last few years we've been working to tell the remarkable story of this once-forgotten piece of history, especially the period of time that they were in the USA. Now, thanks to the hard work of modern women across the world, this story is no longer forgotten. Our talk today is going to give a summary of that history, but our main priority is to shed new light on Elined Prys, one of the 3 women selected as a delegate for the Welsh Women's Peace Appeal in 1924. Modern researchers have been able to learn about Annie and Mary Ellis, but not so much on Elined Prys. Thanks to the generosity of Elined's family and some financial donations from the Madog Center in Ohio, the North American Foundation for Welsh activities, we were able to discover her personal letters during the post-First World War years. These letters have been enormously helpful in shedding light on Elined's life and her work, her personal beliefs, and even her time as a delegate in America. Our talk today will use those letters and other information we have discovered to explore why Elined would have been chosen to serve as a peace delegate. And by the end of this talk, we hope to paint a picture for you of Elined as a woman with intelligence and wit, and also a woman who possessed a love for her family and friends, inspired to see the best in people. It is these qualities that brought Elined to the peace delegation, and we hope the story of her life will inspire you today as it has inspired us.
Elined Prys was born in Trefeca, Wales on February 16th, 1895. She was the daughter of Elizabeth Parry and Reverend Owen Prys, who at the time of Elined's birth was the principal of Coleg Trefeca, a Calvinistic Methodist theological seminary. Reverend Prys was also one of the most famous preachers of his day, known for his intellect and fervour. When the coleg was renamed and moved to Aberystwyth, in 1906, Reverend Prys became the first principal of this new institution, called the Aberystwyth Theological College, whose building some of you may know, it's just 2 doors down from the old college. So Elined and her family moved from the Brecon Beacons area to Llyest, Aberystwyth, when she was around 10 years old. Just real quick, this afternoon we found out today that Owen Prys' obituary in 1936 said he died at Llyest on North Road in Aberystwyth. Yesterday, with the family, we went to see this Llyest off of Waenfawr Road. So more research is in production. Elined had one younger sister named Gwenllian, and both daughters were brought up in a deeply religious household, an upbringing that would shape both their lives. Interestingly, Gwen, like her older sister, was involved in the Welsh peace movement and spent time abroad working with Christian youth organisations. In 1925, Gwen was the representative from Aberystwyth to the Welsh League of Nations Union, and later spent almost a decade as a missionary in East India, before returning to Wales to work with churches here. So Elined and Gwen must have been raised to be both spiritually devout and dedicated to trying to live out their religious principles. Elined certainly would go on to do just that. In fact, she started her work for the peace movement even before World War I had ended. In January 1918, Elined, still an undergraduate, participated in a failed attempt to host a peace conference at the Shiloh Schoolroom in Aberystwyth. The object of the conference, Elined wrote to the Cymru News and Meirionydd Standard, was to discuss the general question of peace from the standpoint of Christianity. However, the conference could not go ahead, Elined said, because threats of hooliganism from a section of the population of Aberystwyth. In her letter to the editor of the newspaper, Elined protested strenuously against those who were so obsessed with victory over Germany that they would silence Christian voices seeking a peaceful resolution to the war. It seems many of the people of Aberystwyth had little interest in pacifism and tended to view any discussions of peace with skepticism and even hostility. In response to that hostility, Elined wrote, "As far as this war is concerned, the great majority of those who had attended the conference would without doubt have upheld the view that the best pathway to peace is to prosecute the war vigorously to the end, and all who held that belief were at perfect liberty to attend and state their views in a more rational way than by breaking up the conference. If there were others who held different views on war and peace, they were equally anxious to reach a right solution and equally anxious about the true honor and welfare of their country. And as such, they had equal rights to state their opinions. Prussia may refuse freedom of speech to Alsace-Lorraine, but Britain, when she is fighting that spirit of Prussianism, may not give herself the lie by refusing it to her own citizens." Here, we can see how Elined's peace activism is driven by her Christian faith. And we can also see her embracing the value of discourse and dissent. Indeed, she even asserts that Britain can only claim the moral high ground over Germany if Britain maintains its British values, including the rights of citizens to voice their own opinions, even when they go against the grain of public sentiment. Those who try to shut down conversations are no better than the Germans who they were seeking to defeat.
Later that year, Elined graduated summa cum laude from the University of Wales in Aberystwyth with a bachelor's degree in philosophy. From 1918 to 1919, she pursued graduate work at the Women's Newnham College in Cambridge University. Elined was at Cambridge when the armistice was signed in November 1918, and in her letters to her family, which were saved by her mother, she describes attending Thanksgiving services. One was so crowded she couldn't get in. Elined has some interesting reflections on the significance of Germany's surrender. She wrote her family thus: "The awful thing to me is that people are taking victory in such an unchastened spirit. It is first rejoicing at peace and at Germany's downfall. In none of these services there was a hint of mercy or generosity towards the enemy. The nation doesn't seem to have learnt the lesson and humbled herself one whit more than when the war broke out. In fact, she's much more self-righteous and overbearing now than she was then. Well, I suppose it's only future generations will see things straight and humble themselves in mercy for us." Elined, studying international politics, clearly felt uncomfortable with the lack of nuance in the wave of celebrations that followed the defeat of Germany in 1918. Perhaps the faith that Elined placed in future generations can explain her decision to leave Cambridge and join the student Christian movement and work with refugees in Romania. She wrote to her parents in July 1919, asking for the permission for her to travel to Paris and for 3 months train for the mission. It was to be followed by a posting in either Belgium, Romania, or Serbia. Elined had heard a speech from one of the student Christian movement officials asking for volunteers to work abroad, and she immediately jumped at the chance. As she put it in a letter to her parents, "You won't say no, will you? I have never had quite such clear leading before. For the last 3 years or more, I seem to have more or less drifted on in college, with no very settled sense of vocation. But as it were, waiting for something to turn up, and now things just seem to have settled themselves, rather than be settled by me, and I feel less doubt and more tranquility than I've ever had before." Elined's parents did consent, and now off she went to Paris, where she was trained to work with the student Christian movement. For the most part, Elined seems to have been inspired by the lectures she attended excuse me, and site visits to student Christian movement locations in Europe, and France especially. However, she did express some displeasure at some of the encounters she had. For example, the joint camp they held with one of the Christian Boy Scouts groups in France. Overall, it was enjoyable, Elined wrote to her family, but the only thing that we all, I think, as students felt was wrong about it was the militaristic bias. For it is there, whatever its supporters might say, the khaki uniform, the military drill, the military terms, patrol, and so on. The saluting of the national flag, and above all, the singing of the Marseillaise. Until the national anthems of all the countries are changed so that loyalty is no longer expressed in terms of war alone, I think they ought not to be sung by people with an international outlook. As for the flag, there ought to be a big flag to stand for the world and a small national one in the corner to merge for loyalty to humanity. Here we can see Elined making clear she has very little interest in nationalism, and she has a strong sense that her work for the student Christian movement ought to maintain its international focus.
In 1920, Elined took up her post in Bucharest, working for the World Student Christian Federation, setting up its student Christian movement in Romania. Elined will ultimately stay in Romania until 1923. Her work was varied, including organizing groups and events, teaching English, and working with refugees. For example, Elined organized a clothing donation in Britain for refugees in Romania. Most of Romania had been a war zone during World War I, with both sides fighting over Romania's territory and resources, so there was much work to do to rebuild. Further complicating matters was the war fought between Hungary and Romania in 1919. Elined, who already knew French and German, as well as Welsh and English, quickly learned Romanian so that she could do her work more effectively. Reports from Romanians praised her for giving excellent addresses in the Romanian language, which she had only learned 6 months ago. This was a formative time for Elined because she gained confidence as she started to carve out her own path. Most of her letters from this period are chock full of details of the retreats she ran, the people she met while traveling, and so forth. And she was an incredibly busy woman, but she had same core values drove her. For example, writing to her family in 1921, Elined spoke of how several students who last year had quite materialistic views of life, in theory, have changed in the direction of idealism. I remarked on it to one of them the other day, and he said, yes, that was true. There was a strong tendency away from materialism. Whether there was any special books influencing people that way, I don't know. Or whether it is that after the mad reaction towards pleasure and enjoyment of the after-war period, people are now turning to something much more deeply satisfying. And as this boy thought, at any rate, the movement is there, and it is our opportunity. It was an opportunity for Elined too, an opportunity to spread her wings and to see just how much she could accomplish on her own merits.
In early 1923, Elined returned to Wales. Of course, 1923 would prove to be a very important year in the history of Welsh peace movement and activism. It had a long presence in Wales going back to the 19th century, but after World War I, the movement gained new momentum. Many firsts were in Wales, such as teachers being the first to teach the principles of the League of Nations. Wales lost 20% of its male population in World War I. 20%, that's a staggering number, especially when you consider that it was young men who died in that war, which would affect the demographics of Welsh society for decades to come. For many people, of course, the high death toll was personal. So many people had lost fathers, brothers, sons, friends. That is hard for us now to comprehend. But it's easy for us to understand why Welsh women who had recently won the right to vote and who were dealing with the ramifications of losing such a large percentage of the male population would have been particularly interested in the peace movement and a push for a more peaceful world. The Welsh peace movement was particularly invested in supporting the League of Nations, an international organisation that was established in 1920 with the goal of preventing world war through diplomacy. A uniquely Welsh League of Nations union was established in 1922 with the goal of supporting specifically Welsh communities' efforts that have been done over the decades since. And this work is only some of what's been done over the decades, For example, the youth message of peace and goodwill is still sent every year. On May 18th, the anniversary of the first peace conference at The Hague in 1899. But one of the Welsh peace movement's most stunning achievements was the peace appeal and the petition from the women of Wales to the women of the United States in 1924. The plan for this petition was put into place by leaders in the Welsh League of Nations Union in 1923, I believe here in Aberystwyth, as the United States was debating whether or not to join the League of Nations. It was considered crucial to the League's success for the United States to join. But the United States was going through a period where isolationism was very popular, and many Americans thought that getting involved in foreign affairs would distract from domestic issues. Annie Hughes Griffiths had hoped to meet President Woodrow Wilson, a man who had supported the journey to membership of the League of Nations. But by 1924, he had passed away. President Calvin Coolidge was less in favour of membership. The Welsh women peace activists hoped that if Welsh women were able to appeal directly to American women, they might be able to make a difference in public opinion. American women, after all, had just won the right to vote in 1920, and of course there was a vigorous peace movement in the United States which included many prominent women. So the Welsh women peace activists got to work. A beautiful leather-bound memorial containing the text of the appeal was created, with a moving message to women of America from the women of Wales, which in part says, "From the women of Wales to the women of the United States of America, we come with a message of peace and goodwill. We, the women of Wales and Monmouthshire, who have been witnesses of the suffering of the Great War and who have been brought face to face with the menace of another conflict, appeal to you, the women of America, to join us in the crusade for a war-free world. We ask you to use your influence with your government to bring about such action as will ensure the complete establishment of the League of Nations as a means to attainment of a war-free world." And they concluded by stating, "The future is big with hope, as the women of this generation will do our part." To create the petition, they set up county and local organising committees in towns and villages across Wales and in Welsh communities outside of Wales, such as in London and Liverpool. And they arranged for the signatures to be collected and then passed them on to the Welsh League of Nations Union in Cardiff. On the screen you can see a part of one of the sheets used to acquire signatures and a part of the page from the list of organisers. There are around 400 of these community organisers, and together they collected the signatures of almost 400,000 women on a petition some 7 miles long. This really was a grassroots effort In addition to the petition itself, an oak chest was crafted to hold the signed petition forms.
So in 1924, a delegation of 3 Welsh women sailed to the United States to formally present the appeal and petition to the women of the United States. One of these delegates was our very own Elined Prys, who travelled to the United States with Hughes Griffiths in January 1924 on the RMS Cedric. In New York, they met up with Mary Ellis, who was already in New York, planning events and arranging all the details. You can see the image of the luncheon. Do we have this one?
I'm sorry.
There we go. You can see the image of the luncheon on your screen with what looks like our delegates on their feet, perhaps in mid-speech. This event garnered a lot of press attention, which was part of the point. Their goal was to spread the message of peace in the hopes of convincing American women to support their cause. Hughes Griffiths and Elined Prys both spoke at this luncheon. With the help of prominent American women peace activists, Harriet Laidlaw, Ruth Morgan, and Carrie Chapman Catt, a leader of suffrage in the USA and founder of the League of Women Voters, the Welsh Women's Delegation formally delivered the appeal and petition at a special luncheon held in New York City, in the presence of over 600 American women, representing 60 national women's clubs with membership of over 16 million people, including prominent public figures such as Eleanor Roosevelt, who was to become First Lady in 1933. After the luncheon, the delegates then traveled to see the White House in Washington, D.C., which is where this picture on your screen was taken. They met with President Calvin Coolidge and Secretary of State Charles Evans Hughes, both of whom have Welsh roots. These were what you might call courtesy visits, by which I mean there was no real policy discussed. The goal really was to speak woman to woman, not to try to negotiate with political leaders like Coolidge. Following the end of the official East Coast events, Hughes Griffiths and her travel companion Gladys Thomas traveled across the USA with the peace message, and that was their journey. On each stop, they met with local Welsh societies and attended Welsh chapels, sharing the peace message as well as having a grand old time as tourists. Elined was due to travel with them, but stayed in New York for medical appointments. After these few weeks of individual travel, the Welsh delegates, including Elined, returned back home to Wales.
So how did Elined get involved with this project? Although Elined had been in Romania in the years leading up to the Welsh Women's Peace Appeal and petition, she was apparently very well regarded in Wales. She returned to Wales in 1923 from Romania, the same year in which the 390,000 plus 296 signatures were being gathered for the Welsh Women's Peace Petition. In fact, all 3 women in her family, herself, Sister Gwenllian, and her mother Elizabeth, signed the peace petition, and you can see it on their 3 signatures on the screen. Elined also published an account of her time in Romania in Efrydydd, the magazine sponsored by the student Christian movement, and Deyrnas, a youth Christian movement focused on contemporary issues such as peace. By the end of 1923, Elined had become known in Wales for her international outlook and her peace advocacy. It was Mary Ellis, one of the other delegates, who ultimately suggested that Elined be invited to serve as a delegate for the peace petition. In December 23, Mary Ellis offered Elined's name to Hughes Griffiths, the leader of the delegation. Ellis pointed out that because Elined was younger than the other delegates, she would represent the younger moderns, whereas we are the moderns. Elined had 2 other points working for her favour. First, it was thought she would be a suitable representative due to her work abroad with refugees. Who better to speak about the horrors of war than someone who had spent years helping people suffering in its aftermath? The second, perhaps more practical reason to invite Elined was that Elined would be able to pay her own way. Ultimately, Elined was invited to join the delegation, and she accepted the offer. And so in February 1924, Elined travelled to the USA as part of the delegation. At this point, Elined started sending letters home again, giving us invaluable insights into the Welsh peace delegation to America and about her own time in America. Elined may not have been involved in the actual organisation of the Apêl and Petition, but she was deeply invested in its mission. In her first letter home, written from on board the RMS Cedric, "I understand the mission, and we delegates are to be prayed for in the churches on Sunday. I'm so glad, because people have spoken so much of the nice trip, as though we were all going for a holiday." Clearly, Elined is aware of the significance of the mission. Moreover, Elined discusses how her work for the Welsh Women's Peace Delegation aligns with her religious beliefs. She says, "I was glad of what Mam said about the importance of this mission and what it may accomplish, and I'm trying hard to realise it as fully as possible. Mrs. Griffiths," that's Annie, "is terribly impressed with our responsibility, and I read a good bit of the life of Henry Richard, which I got from the library there, while at Bala, and I was very thrilled with it and began to feel in the succession a little bit, and a great succession it is too." Here it's helpful to know that Henry Richard was a 19th century Welsh congregational minister and member of Parliament, who became famous for his peace pacifist organisations that hosted several international peace congresses. So you can hear Elined thinking of her own role in the delegation as continuing a proud tradition of a Christian peace movement.
That religious component comes out even further in the sentences that follow, when Elined continues, "I was reading 2nd Isaiah for some time before leaving home too, and the last days, the passages on the servant nation seem particularly appropriate. I have grasped thee by the hand. I have set thee to be a light to the nations. Hasn't he chosen Wales for some purpose too in these latter days? And the prophet's own feeling of being used as an instrument of purposes, great and mighty beyond his own powers or grasp, is very inspiring when one feels unable to appreciate all the possibilities of one yet feels dimly to be part of a vast scheme of providence. My chief prayer just now is, make me thine instrument, whether I can see that work in all its scope or not." Clearly, Elined is viewing the work of the delegation as part of her Christian duty, but you can also get a sense of her tendency to look at matters through a deeply philosophical lens. She's constantly searching for the deeper meaning of life and constantly trying to figure out what she is being called to do. Yet, Elined adds an intriguing addendum to this prayer, which suggests she is not simply looking to be led. After writing, "Whether I can see the work in all its scope or not," Elined continues, "But I do emphatically make the further prayer, let me not be thy blind instrument." The original prayer omits the not. I forget whose prayer it is. Is it Newman's? As it happens, Elined is correct in ascribing the line to the Catholic philosopher and Cardinal St. John Henry Newman. Her letter doesn't go any further into her reasoning for this additional prayer, but it does point to Elined's desire to be both a servant of God and an independent thinker, a combination that will ultimately lead Elined down some very interesting paths, but we'll come to that later. Once Elined and the other delegates landed in America, Elined had little time to philosophize. An article in the Western Mail newspaper quoted Elined describing the delegation's early days in New York as follows. "We were whirled away into such a succession of visits and reception as only American hospitality knows how to shower on the guests." Elined was a little more forthright in her letter from New York to her family, and Elined wrote, "Ever since we landed, we have been hustled around in truly American style, so that we have hardly had time to breathe. What with luncheons and teas, etc., arranged by the ladies who are running us, and for all my own friends at the YW officials, I have to see every minute is taken up, and I am awfully tired." Elined had reasons to be tired, She had spent the last several years working tirelessly in Romania, and soon after returning to Wales, Elined had then accepted the invitation to join the delegation. Despite her exhaustion, Elined clearly gave her all to the delegation. She spoke at the Biltmore Luncheon, where the petition was formally presented to the women of the United States, and she was also present for the meeting with President Calvin Coolidge a few days later. Elined also delivered an address when the delegation attended a secondary presentation of the appeal and petition to the American Association of University Women's Center in Washington, D.C., in front of roughly 150 attendees. In recognition of the formal handing over the memorial appeal and chest of signed petition papers to the National Committee for the Prevention of War. Elined summarized all these events in a letter back to her family as follows. Well, the great events of presenting the memorial here and in Washington are over and went off most successfully. The one here in New York City was the really important one, as New York is the real center of things. And it was the ladies here who Mary Ellis had seen and spoken to. They were really thrilled, as she had said, regarding it as a remarkable achievement that we should have got from 60 to 65% of all the available signatures, and a wonderful demonstration of the mind of a nation. They felt it ought to be made as widely known as possible, and it was bound to prove a great inspiration. Elined then goes on to provide more details about her dealings with the American women who helped organize the presentation of the petition in New York City and other events in Washington, D.C. One was Ruth Morgan, who was descended from the Morgan family of Brecon area of Wales, and her great-grandfather was a signer of the Declaration of Independence, and in World War I, she was the High Commissioner of the Red Cross in France. Elined wrote, Miss Ruth Morgan, one of the chief leaders of the League of Women Voters, a large and powerful organization, told us quite frankly they were glad to seize upon it as a fine opportunity for propaganda and publicity for all the organizations that are working towards America's fuller participation in world politics and the achievement of peace. The amount of work being done by women's organizations in that way over here is simply colossal. The League of Women Voters, the Nonpartisan League of Nations Association, the Federation of Women's Clubs, and dozens of others all have peace in some form in their programs. Some have the League, and many have the World Court. The latter is what they are pushing for right now, as it is the first step to fuller cooperation, and they are pushing it too, bringing pressure to bear in every possible way on the die-hard senators, who must be just as thick-skinned as men are, to resist the vigorous scorn and contumely that is poured upon them by these public women. It's really interesting to hear Elined's take on this, because she recognizes that the petition is as much about strategic publicity as it is about giving voice to the women who lost family members and friends in World War I. And she also recognizes the political nature of the act. Although the organizations Elined lists in her letter were ostensibly apolitical, their ends needed to be achieved politically. And with her passage of bills through Congress, with the passage of bills through Congress and swaying public opinion is a necessary part of achieving that.
The next few sentences of this letter she wrote also foreground the way that women's suffrage movement was an important precursor to the 1920s peace movement. Picking up where she left off with the die-hard senators who are just as thick-skinned as men are made, she quotes a few words spoken by one of the main American organizers, Harriet Laidlaw. This set of petty, self-important ignoramuses, strutting it in their little day and holding back the nation with their selfish ideas and mean prejudices from taking that part in the world that a great democratic people should. That is a specimen of the way Mrs. James Laidlaw, president of the Pro-League Council and of our reception committee, speaks of them in public. She's the most charming and gracious of women, so the words have the more force coming from her. We told her after hearing her the first time that we were quite afraid of seeing her arrested, then and there for libel, but she said laughing, "Oh, that was nothing," and assured us that they had learned in the suffrage campaign just how far they could go. The Foreign Relations Committee of the Senate, which, as Mrs. Laidlaw said, has no foreign relations, of course comes in for the worst attacks. As Harriet Laidlaw noted, it was the women's suffrage movement that laid the groundwork for some of the activists of the peace movement. So in this letter, we can see Elined thinking about the politics and legal questions inherent in peace activism. These kinds of details go back to her desire to be God's instrument, but not God's blind instrument. Instead, she's combining the idealism that comes from her Christian faith with her recognition of the need to work within political reality. It's interesting, too, that she records Harriet Laidlaw's comments about the peace movement's debts to the women's suffrage movement, because those words echo the inspiration she found in Henry Richards' idea of succession of peace activists, who brought the world ever closer to true universal peace. For Elined, it seems, the ability of women to vote is part of the sequence of events necessary for achieving world peace. So there's a kind of pro-feminism to Elined's words here. When the delegation's main work was complete, Elined took the opportunity to visit friends in nearby cities, including some friends she knew through her work with the Young Women's Christian Association. She had personal trips to Boston, Philadelphia, Buffalo, and Rhode Island. Elined gave speeches there and addressed meetings of the YWCA and the League of Women Voters. Elined also joined Annie Hughes Griffiths in New York City in March, when Annie was speaking at the League of Nations Non-Partisan Association at the Biltmore Hotel again. So clearly, even though the delegation was officially over, the ladies were still working to spread the message of peace. Thus, although Elined was a late addition to the delegation, she threw her energy and talent into the mission of the Welsh Women's Peace Appeal. Her Christian faith also seems to have been a driving force for her, encouraging her to embrace the role she had been offered and to do her utmost to spread the message of peace. In addition to feeling a sense of vocation, Elined also seems to have developed a greater sense of how to balance idealism with pragmatism in new ways.
So Elined spent much of the rest of 1924 occupied with personal matters. Her wedding. During the trip to America, Annie Hughes Griffiths recorded with some shock in her diary that Elined had become engaged to an Austrian count. But the full story was much more complicated. It is true that Elined announced her engagement during her trip to America. Her husband-to-be was a man named Walter Maria Kochnig, an Austrian from Judenburg, whom she had met through the activities of the International Students' Christian Movement. They must have met sometime in 1921. We do have a letter from Elined to her family from August of 1921, where in response to some query from her family, she jokingly says, "Oh, I'm not married to a Romanian noble just yet." This is pure speculation, but it's tantalizing to think that some rumor of her meeting Walter had made its way to her family's ears in Wales. We don't know the specific details about how they met, but family lore is that he helped her out of a mine crater that she had fallen into Romania. At any rate, it seems that when Elined returned to Wales in 1923, she and Walter had already fallen in love and wanted to marry. We discovered the draft of the beautiful letter that Walter sent to Elined's parents on the eve of their marriage. It was his cross-outs and misspellings and everything. Elined seems to have kept the draft letter in a purse of hers, which is where we found it. In that letter, Walter expresses his deep love for Elined and vows to uphold his responsibilities as her husband. He even describes how he first saw Elined when she was giving a speech on pacifism. So Elined's work for the peace movement was actually what brought her and Walter together. And as Walter wrote in that letter to Elined's parents, "So I must write to you. Elined will not be lost for you nor for her country. We both shall try to realize the best of our countries, and if we succeed in our purpose, we shall live in a sphere where both our nations will be united. Only by each of us priming the best of his and her country shall we realize our higher purpose." So Elined and Walter married on December 4th, 1924, in a Welsh Presbyterian chapel in London. Clearly, one of the things that brought Elined and Walter together was their deep sense of service for their countries and the desire to bring the world together in harmony. The couple moved to Germany, then to Geneva, where Walter worked for the International Student Service. And during her time there, Elined published articles and continued to contribute to Welsh Outlook magazine, which was supportive of the Welsh League of Nations Union. It is also in Geneva where they had their 3 children, Christopher, Enid, and John. Elined became a psychologist and follower of Carl Jung, and the Swiss psychologist exploring in particular the relationship between Jungism psychology and Quaker spiritual belief. Quakerism, Jung wrote to Elined, which would have been the religion he would have chosen, as the beliefs and the theories were similar to his own. From then on, Elined became an expert in both Jungism and the Quaker movement. So Elined and Walter moved to America in 1936, where Walter took a job as an adjunct professor of comparative literature at Smith and Mount Holyoke College in Northampton, Massachusetts. Walter later became a diplomat in the American State Department and was a specialist in establishing the United Nations and UNESCO, as was Gwilym Davies, with whom he was in contact at the time. Elined is remembered in America as the founder of the Quaker Friends Conference on Religion and Psychology, and she passed away on June 30th, 1983, at Penwood Village in Newtown, Pennsylvania.
So how did we come across Elined's letters? By 2023, our research team in the US had already done much work on the delegate's time in the US. And Anne Griffith, our team leader, and her sister Nia from Llandudno had been to the Smithsonian's American History Museum because we'd heard that the chest and the petition were there. And they were able to see a few pages of the petition. From that day on, the work began to ask the Smithsonian to allow us to digitize the petition. But as we all know, the Smithsonian in Washington, D.C. did more than that. They donated the chest and the petition back to Wales. We call it
whatever.
Rematricize the petition back to Wales instead of repatrialize. 2 copies of the appeal were produced originally, and one is here in the library for now, and one remains in the Smithsonian American History Museum in Washington, D.C. In 2022, one of our team leaders, Luann Broad, was able to track down Elined and Walter's descendants, their son John, seen in the picture, his wife Mary, and their children Mark, Mia, and Michelle, in California, of all places. We were able to contact the family, and they have been incredibly generous in allowing us to meet with them and have become good friends. Even more amazingly, they gave us permission to go to the summer cottage near Northampton, Massachusetts, where Elined and Walter spent many months outside of term time at college, up in the Berkshire Hills of Massachusetts, away somewhat from the summer heat and humidity. With the financial support of a grant from the North America Wales Foundation and the Madog Centre for Welsh Studies in Ohio, 3 of us travelled to the summer cottage. Elined's family had left out some dusty boxes full of papers to explore. Go ahead, see what we can find. So we got to work, but we quickly realised that what we were looking at weren't just documents and magazines. They were Elined's letters, home to her family. The family thought they would all be in Welsh and hadn't looked at them, but most of them were in English. That was the day we discovered the letters she wrote during her time as a peace delegate, describing her journey to and around America in 1924, 101 years ago. The letters were in excellent condition, tied up in groups with fine string bows. They were an emotional find for all of us. These letters were hugely significant as they allowed us to fill in some gaps in our knowledge of these events.
So since that first trip to the summer cottage, we've been back to retrieve more boxes, and on one long weekend, 4 of us scanned and read almost 1,000 pages of letters, plus photos. We also catalogued them. And since then, the family who wanted to preserve these letters have been asked if they would like to donate them to the archives here at Aberystwyth's National Library of Wales. And they agreed, and just yesterday, the family donated Elyned's letters to the archives here at the National Library during the opening ceremonies of the new exhibit, Peace Matters, featuring the chest, the peace petition, its journey, and the people who made it happen. These letters now will be archived and will hopefully inspire future generations of peace activists.
We hope this has shone a well-deserved light on Elined Prys, Cochnig, a unique contribution to the proud legacy of Welsh peace activism. She was a fiercely independent thinker who wasn't afraid to show radical empathy, even to her country's enemies. She was a devoted humanitarian who looked at the world from an international perspective. Perhaps most importantly, Elined dared to dream of a more peaceful world, and we expect she will inspire future generations by this donation. Diolch yn fawr. I would like now to invite Elyned's grandchildren, Michelle Gautret and Mark Kochnig, onto stage, and we will take some questions.
Well, thanks for a terrific talk. Such fascinating insights and just a deeply humbling story, really, to understand more about what was happening in and around the peace petition, but Elyned's early life and her life after the petition, which is fantastic. And Mark and Michelle, welcome. Felly, da ni efo chydig o amser am gwestiynau, some time for questions.
In English, please.
In English, please. Well, I'll translate, it's fine. If it's in Welsh, that is. Romanian, not so well.
No.
These days, a bit rusty. Who's going to be first to ask a question, please? Yes. Microphone, Rodri, diolch.
Diolch yn fawr. Thank you so much. That was really, really inspiring. And my name's Craig Owen. I'm from the Welsh Centre for International Affairs and been researching and exploring this for a few years now. And Elined was always the person who I thought there was a huge story yet to tell. So it's wonderful to finally hear that story coming together. You mentioned Walter Kochnig's role in the development of the United Nations when he worked in the State Department, and similarly I'd seen some hints at that in researching Gwilym Davies's role with the Welsh League of Nations. And I wonder if in your research or in Elyned's letters, if you'd if you had any sense of her own interests in that, because I can imagine that with the internationalist life that you've just portrayed, she and they, almost as a power couple of internationalism, must have played a huge force in those negotiations at the end of World War II. Obviously, all of the ideas that led to the creation of the United Nations didn't come out of nowhere. They came from the actions of the peace movements over the decades before, and that seems to be the magic moment where it all came together. So I wondered if you'd had any hints of what they managed to pull off in those incredible years at all.
I can take that question. When Walter was in Germany and Switzerland after they married, he was working for an organisation that that found jobs for people, educators, who were being thrown out of their jobs, especially in Germany and also in Switzerland. And they worried that Austria would go the same way. And so he was working on repatriating people back to America or to America, especially in the education field. And eventually he felt that he had to go too, which is why they came to America. He felt he had to get out too. And it's fascinating how it came as a circle, because even though I don't think Elined did much work with the United Nations as much as he did, it came full circle. And it's well documented how he worked for the State Department in that respect. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you. Right, who'd like to go next, please? I've got a question from one of our audience online. Dan.
What has surprised the family most about this chapter of their grandmother's life?
All of it.
Yeah.
I really have to say all of it, because we had heard stories of Romania and her work fighting for suffrage in Romania and working with refugees. We knew that Walter, his focus was on refugees in the learned professions. He wrote a book, Unemployment in the Learned Professions, with the International Student Services, etc. And of course, all the Jungian, the Quaker, everything that happened after, and probably what she was focusing on while he was working more towards the UN Charter, etc. But then we had never, ever heard anything about the peace petition. We had heard that she had been to conferences for the YMCA. I knew she was very involved in that. But just the scope of her intelligence, the scope of her dedication, the clear-headedness, the vocation to take everything that she'd learned through the religious beliefs of her parents and to, I don't know, just what a mind, and what an unfortunate thing that we weren't able to be able to discuss all that with her, because we were too young by the time she passed away.
And didn't see enough. Different coasts.
Yeah. And she was always a very thoughtful woman. She was always very quiet and always pensive and always working, writing, seeing her psychoanalyst, her patients, and writing journals. And she was in charge of a journal called The Inward Light, which was a Quaker journal with the Jungian Quaker Association that she founded in Washington, D.C. And so she was the editor and a contributor frequently to that. And that was a passion of hers, seeking other minds, similar minds, and trying always to create this discourse for peace and enlightenment and personal enlightenment because of the psychoanalytical aspect. Yeah. Everything surprised us. Everything today. I saw a presentation a year ago at NAFAO, the North American Festival of Wales event a year ago, and it was wonderful already, but how you fleshed it out is just marvelous. Yeah.
Thank you. Right, next question. Yeah.
This is wonderful stuff. I mean, the excitement of finding those letters which had been unread must have been a marvellous moment. But you said she was a student of international relations in 1919. She would have been one of the first students of that department and one of the very first women. And in a department which had been created to promote peace. And Lord Davies, who'd founded it, of course, actually, the idea was that those students would leave Aberystwyth as ambassadors for peace. So she could not have exemplified the ambitions of Lord Davies and Llandinum any more than she did. And I wondered, actually, did you find evidence in the correspondence or in her anything that she left behind, which was connected to Aberystwyth, which is such a significant story for Aberystwyth, any permanent relationship that she had, because he, of course, was very active in promoting the League of Nations Association in the UK. That would have had an infectious impact across the United States as well. So did you find anything else about him and her in the correspondence?
About connections in Aberystwyth, especially?
Well, with Lord Davis and his own work in promoting the United Nations.
No, we have not found that yet. Okay. No. I know she'd heard of him. I think her father made sure that she knew of his work, but we haven't found anything else yet. No.
And I think it was mentioned last night, Gwendolyn Davies was in line to attend the as one of the delegates of the peace petition, but she was unwell.
That's right.
And so you can see the letter in the exhibition from Mary Ellis to Annie Cwrt-Mawr suggesting alternatives. And this is where Elined Nain comes in.
And I believe we have found, because there's copious amounts of there's more boxes, many more boxes, and I don't know what we'll find. We found things from Elined's father, Elined Prys, who was principal of the university here in Aberystwyth. This was her home. This is the place that she felt was home. And her sister, Gwen, as well. And in some of Gwen's diaries, I believe she speaks of the Davies sisters. It's quite possible that they were socializing, and so we'll try and, of course, unearth as much as we can, because the diaries are quite fascinating. They're during the World War I and beyond, and everything from, strolling down to tea and then talking about invasions. So we should...
They didn't meet. They would have been total soulmates.
Yeah.
Thank you for the question, Kay. Right, next question, please. Oh, we have another question. Does anybody wish to ask a question here as well? Any hands ready to go up? I've got one ready to go up, so we'll come to you soon after this online question. Diolch.
If Elined was here now, what do you think her quest would be?
If she were living in the United States, she would have her work cut out for her. And I just, every time, anytime the president opens his mouth, I think that my grandparents are rolling around in their graves. That's my personal opinion. It would again be, I don't know, it would be so hard, but it would again be just trying to, civil discourse, reaching out across the aisle, things that seem quite impossible at this very moment in time. And I don't know how she would approach it, because I don't know. Do you?
It seems
it's such a different world.
like a Sisyphean task. We're fighting the same things and keep going.
We have a lot of women's marches in America, and I think she would have been leading the women's marches.
Yes. It's just that education, higher learning, knowledge does not seem to be what's cherished now. And there's a sort of a rejection of it. And that's been happening for the past couple decades in the making. And I think she would be much, you just have to find a different way. I wish I had her mind, and then I could tell you a better answer. But she would have her hands full.
Great question. Troubling answers.
Yeah.
Yes.
Diolch yn fawr. Again, going back to the letters, really, I'm delighted that the letters have come to the National Library. It's absolutely fascinating. Really looking forward to being able to read them. Just a question about the period when they were in Geneva.